I used to work as a custodian at a middle school for nearly 5 years. My shift started at 10 at night and ended when the first buses pulled in at dawn. I liked it at first. Quiet, peaceful, no kids or teachers to deal with. But over time, the silence started to feel wrong. The halls creaked, pipes groaned, and sometimes it sounded like the building was alive. When you're alone, every sound feels closer than it should be. Still, nothing in that school ever made me feel as uneasy as the basement. It was cold, damp, and filled with forgotten things. Old desks, broken furniture, boxes of books covered in dust. The lights barely worked, and the air smelled like mold. One of the older janitors once told me, "Don't go down there unless you have to." I used to laugh at that, but after a few nights I stopped laughing. It was about 2 years into the job when that night happened. I still remember how normal everything seemed at first, the kind of night where the hum of the vending machines and the distant buzz of the lights were the only things keeping me company. I had my usual list of tasks taped to the cart: sweep the gym, clean the restrooms, mop the cafeteria, restock supplies. But one note at the bottom made me stop. "Bring up folding chairs for tomorrow's event." My stomach sank, because I already knew where those chairs were stored: the basement. That basement was the one place in the entire school I hated going to. I had managed to avoid it for weeks, sometimes months, finding excuses or convincing others to fetch what I needed from down there. But that night, I had no choice. I stood in front of the basement door, my hand hovering over the cold metal handle, debating if I could leave it for the morning. My supervisor would definitely ask why. So, I took a deep breath, grabbed my flashlight, and pushed the door open. The hinges screamed as it swung out, echoing down the stairwell like a warning. Each step I took echoed back at me, too loud, like I was disturbing something that wanted to stay asleep. The air grew colder the deeper I went. I flipped the switch at the bottom of the stairs, but only 2 fluorescent lights buzzed to life. They flickered weakly, leaving most of the hallway swallowed by shadows. The smell of wet cement and mold filled the air, thick enough that I could almost taste it. I turned on my flashlight and started walking, its narrow beam cutting through the dark. The chairs were in the second storage room on the left. The first was packed floor to ceiling with broken desks and forgotten furniture. When I reached the second, the door was half rusted shut. I pulled it open, and it let out a squeal like metal scraping on glass. Inside, everything was still. Dust floated in the air, catching the weak light. The folding chairs were stacked unevenly against the far wall, leaning, like they might topple over at any second. I bent down and started pulling them out, trying to carry as many as I could in one go. That's when I heard it, a sound so soft I almost thought I imagined it at first. A slow, dragging noise, like the scuff of a shoe sliding across the floor. I froze. My arms stiffened around the chairs, breath caught halfway in my throat. The sound stopped. For a few seconds I didn't move. I could hear my own heartbeat, loud and fast, echoing in my ears. I turned my flashlight toward the hallway and waited. Nothing. Just silence. "Probably the pipes," I whispered, though I didn't believe it. I forced a nervous laugh and carried the first load toward the stairs, but halfway there, something cold brushed my face. I stopped instantly. The basement was always stuffy and warm, with no air movement at all, but this felt like standing next to an open freezer door. I swept the light around. Empty hallway, still air, concrete walls. My mouth was dry and every instinct told me to go back upstairs. Instead, I set the chairs by the stairs and went back for the rest. When I stepped into the storage room again, I froze. The stack of chairs looked different, like they'd been shifted. A few were leaning the opposite way. One had fallen slightly forward. I frowned, trying to remember exactly how I'd left them. Maybe I'd bumped them earlier. I grabbed another set and started to turn, and that's when I heard it again. A dull thump, then a scraping sound from farther down the hall. My flashlight trembled in my hand as I aimed it toward the noise. About 20 feet away, one of the classroom doors was cracked open. My stomach dropped. I knew for a fact that every classroom was locked before the janitorial shift started. I stood there, staring at that narrow gap of darkness between the door and the frame. Every part of me screamed to run, but I didn't move. I told myself it could have been the air pressure, or maybe the door latch didn't catch. Privy anything that made sense. I walked back to the stairwell, dropped the chairs, then came back, empty-handed but clutching the flashlight tight. The door was still open, just enough that if someone were standing inside, they could be watching me. My throat went dry, my footsteps echoed, too loud as I crept closer. Hello? My voice cracked. It sounded tiny in that big dead space. No answer. I swallowed hard, pushed the door open, and shined my flashlight inside. The beam swept across dusty tables, boxes, broken science equipment. Empty. Nothing there. I stepped inside just far enough to look around, my pulse pounding. That's when I heard it again. A dragging shuffle, this time from behind me. I spun around so fast I almost dropped the light. The hallway outside was empty, but I could feel it, the weight of something unseen watching from the dark. The air felt heavier, thicker. I backed out slowly, my hand shaking, never turning my back to the hallway. When I reached the stairs, I grabbed the chairs I'd left there and ran. 2 steps at a time, not stopping until I reached the main hallway upstairs. I slammed the basement door shut and leaned against the wall, gasping for breath. My hands were slick with sweat, my heart still racing. I told myself it was rats, or maybe the pipes settling. But I couldn't explain the open door. I locked the basement door behind me, even though I wasn't supposed to, and avoided that area for the rest of the night. A week later, I was mopping the floor right above the basement stairs when I heard it again. 3 loud bangs, evenly spaced, like someone slamming their fist into the wall. Boom, boom, boom. The mop slipped from my hands, water splattering across the tiles. I froze. Then the basement door rattled, not lightly. It shook, like someone was on the other side trying to push through. My blood went cold. I stood there, gripping the mop handle, eyes fixed on the door. The sound stopped after a few seconds, and the silence that followed was worse than the noise. That night, I locked the basement again, even though I knew I'd catch hell for it. I never went down there alone after that. Still, sometimes when I walk past that hallway, even now, I feel it, that same icy draft brushing against my face. Like something down there remembers me, and it's still waiting for me to come back. After that night, I never went down into the basement alone again. If anything needed to be brought up, I'd wait until another custodian was there. I never told the others what I'd heard or felt. They would have laughed or said it was just the old school ghost, but deep down, I know what I heard and I know what I felt. Those slow, dragging footsteps behind me weren't my imagination. They were real. And even now, years later, whenever I think about that night, I still get that same sick feeling in my stomach. Like something standing right behind me, waiting for me to turn around. Do you believe old buildings can hold on to the things that once walked their halls? Have you ever experienced something you can't explain? Something that still follows you in your memories? Tell me in the comments. I'd really like to hear your story. And if you want to keep the lights on a little longer tonight, watch the next story. It's even darker. I worked as a custodian at a high school for about 3 years. Being the new guy, I got stuck with the overnight shifts. The building was huge. 4 floors, 2 gyms, and endless hallways that all looked the same after dark. At night it felt like a maze. My job was to go floor by floor, room by room, turning off lights, emptying trash, and locking doors. It usually took the whole night. One Friday, I was alone. My coworker called in sick, so I had the whole place to myself. At first, everything was normal. I cleaned the first floor, mopped the halls, emptied bins. The flickering lights made the shadows jump, but I told myself it was nothing. Around midnight, I went up to the 3rd floor. That floor always felt wrong, quiet, cold, and still. Most rooms were locked or used for storage, filled with old books, broken desks, and dusty lab gear. The air was heavy and dry. Every sound echoed, even my footsteps. And that's when the unease started to creep in. As I walked down the hallway, I passed the rows of lockers. The metallic clicks from the doors and the echo of my boots against the tiles made me jump more than once. I kept reminding myself it was normal, that buildings made sounds like this at night. I was halfway through mopping one of the main hallways when I noticed something strange. A door about 20 feet away was open. That immediately caught my attention because I had already checked all the rooms earlier and every door had been locked. My first instinct was to ignore it and walk past, but something made me stop. I leaned my mop against the wall and slowly walked over, trying not to make a sound, with one of those old wooden classroom doors with a square glass window. I pushed it open carefully and shined my flashlight inside. The room looked empty. Desks were stacked along the walls and boxes sat in the corners. Nothing seemed out of place at first. But then I noticed one of the boxes near the back wall had been moved. It was slightly tilted, not lined up with the others, and there were scuff marks on the floor like it had been dragged. My stomach dropped. I knew I had closed that door earlier, and I knew I hadn't moved that box. Still, I told myself it was probably nothing, just my imagination playing tricks on me because I was tired. I pulled the door shut and went back to mopping, but my mind kept drifting back to that room. I thought maybe a student had snuck in somehow, but all the windows were locked from the inside, and the hallway doors were locked too. I tried to shake the uneasy feeling and focus on my work. After finishing the hallway, I headed toward the stairwell to go down to the second floor. As I passed that same classroom again, my heart nearly stopped. The door was wide open. My breath caught in my throat. I knew I had shut it. I took a few slow steps closer and looked inside. Everything looked the same, except the box. It was now in the middle of the floor. My pulse quickened. I whispered, "Hello? Who's in here?" My voice sounded small in the empty building. For a moment, there was silence. Then, from the back of the room, I heard a deep breathing. It wasn't the wind or the pipes. It was the sound of someone trying to stay quiet, but close enough that I could hear them. My heart started pounding. I tried to convince myself it was a student playing a prank, but how could they have gotten in? I was the only one working that night, and all the doors were locked. My fear turned into panic. I slammed the door shut and ran down the hallway toward the stairwell. My chest was tight and sweat ran down my back. I pressed myself against the stairwell door and listened, trying to calm down. I debated calling my supervisor, hated bothering him in the middle of the night, but I couldn't ignore what I'd just heard. Finally, I pulled out my phone and called him. When he picked up, I told him what happened, trying to keep my voice steady. He said he'd be there in 20 minutes. Those 20 minutes felt like hours. I stayed near the stairs, glancing over my shoulder every few seconds, terrified the door would open again. When he finally arrived, he carried a big flashlight and followed me upstairs. We went straight to the classroom. The door was still open and the box was still sitting in the middle of the floor. We checked everywhere, under the tables, inside the closets, behind the desks, but found nothing. But the room was empty. He suggested I was just tired or that the night was getting to me. I didn't argue, but I knew what I had heard. That slow, heavy breathing wasn't my imagination. I tried to finish the rest of my shift while he was there, but I couldn't stop looking down that hallway. It felt colder now, heavier, like something unseen was watching. Even sweeping and mopping didn't distract me. Every flicker of light made me tense, and every shadow looked like a person standing just out of sight. Weeks later, when I worked with another custodian, I mentioned the classroom. His face went pale. He told me that years ago, a student had been caught hiding in that very room overnight. They'd snuck in to play a prank, but something had scared them so badly that the school stopped using that classroom altogether. It made sense, but it didn't explain the breathing I heard that night. There was no one else in the building. After that, I became more cautious during my shifts. I double-checked every door and moved faster through that hallway. Months later, when I had another overnight shift alone, I avoided the third floor for as long as I could. When I finally had to go up there, I moved quickly, flashlight in hand, refusing to look toward that classroom. The feeling of being watched never really went away. Even when I was far from that hallway, I could still feel it. That same cold weight in the air, and the memory of those slow, deep breaths in the dark. I finished that shift and left as fast as I could, never once looking back. After that night, I refused to work on that floor alone again. Even years later, I'd find reasons to avoid it whenever possible. I never found out if it had been a student hiding or something else. But I'll never forget the sound of that slow, steady breathing coming from a classroom that should have been empty. Even now, I can still hear it sometimes, echoing in my head like it's waiting to start again. Have you ever been alone somewhere and suddenly realized you weren't alone? Tell me your story in the comments. I read every single one, and if you think that was unsettling, wait until you hear the next story. It's darker, and it's real. I worked as a night custodian at an old high school for 2 years, and the place that always got to me was the auditorium. It was massive. 3 floors of seats, a big stage, and heavy curtains that hung from the ceiling. During the day it looked normal, but at night, when the building was empty, it felt completely different. Even with the lights on, the shadows in that room always seemed darker than they should be. Sounds echoed in strange ways too. Every noise stretched and bounced until you couldn't tell where it came from. Most nights I saved the auditorium for last because something about it always made my skin crawl. I started sweeping the aisles between the seats. The old metal chairs creaked with every move, some bolted to the floor, others loose and rattling as I brushed past. The soft scraping sound of the broom echoed through the empty auditorium, bouncing off the walls and high ceiling. It was quiet, too quiet, and every small sound felt magnified. After a few minutes, I thought I heard something else, a faint rustling coming from the stage. I froze, holding my breath, waiting for it to happen again. Maybe a prop had fallen over, I thought, but when I looked up, the stage was empty. I shook my head, forced a small laugh, and told myself it was nothing. Just the building, settling like always. I went back to sweeping, trying to stay focused. A few minutes later, the sound came again. This time, it wasn't just rustling. It was the slow, deliberate sound of footsteps crossing the stage. I stopped sweeping immediately and looked up. My flashlight beam cut through the shadows, landing on the stage where props were stacked in the corners. Nothing moved, but the sound was real. My breathing grew shallow. Slowly, I climbed the steps to the stage, shining the flashlight behind the curtains. The beam revealed ropes, pulleys, old chairs, and painted backdrops leaning against the wall. Everything was covered in dust, and the light made it swirl through the air like it was alive. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was nearby, watching me from just out of sight. I stepped back, whispering to myself that it was probably just a mouse or the building settling, but deep down I knew something felt wrong. I went back to sweeping, moving faster, desperate to finish. My mind wouldn't stop replaying the sound of those slow footsteps. Even though I couldn't hear them anymore, I could almost feel them echoing inside my head. When I finished sweeping the lower level, I started mopping. As I pushed the mop through the aisles, something caught my eye. A shadow shifting across the second tier of seats. I froze, staring at the balcony. The beam of my flashlight shook in my hand. Nothing, no movement. I told myself it was just a trick of the light, but every instinct told me I wasn't alone. I kept my back against the wall as I worked, glancing toward the stage every few seconds. Then I heard it again. A whisper. Low, distant, but definitely real. I couldn't make out words, but it was coming from above me, from the balcony. My heart started pounding. My mouth went dry. I wanted to run, but I didn't. I had to finish the job. I tried to convince myself it was another janitor, or maybe someone outside, but deep down I knew better. I was alone. I kept mopping, my ears straining for every sound. The whispering continued, soft at first, then slowly growing clearer, like it was moving closer. I swallowed hard and called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" My voice cracked and echoed across the room. There was no answer, just the echo fading back toward me. I finished the main floor and turned to clean the stage. The stairs felt longer than usual, every step heavy. Each time I moved my flashlight, I thought I saw something in the corner of my eye. A flicker of movement, a shadow that vanished before I could focus. I reached the stage and looked out over the rows of seats. The light from my flashlight barely reached the balcony, but when it did, I froze. For just a split second, I thought I saw a figure sitting there. A silhouette. Still. Watching me. But when I blinked, it was gone. I told myself it was just a chair or maybe a coat draped over one, but the feeling in my chest wouldn't leave. I started dusting and moving props, anything to distract myself. That's when the whispering came again. Louder this time. Clearer. It sounded like someone saying my name right behind me. I spun around so fast the flashlight slipped from my hands and clattered onto the stage. The beam rolled across the floor, slicing through the dark, but there was nothing there. The curtains were still, the props untouched. But I knew what I had heard. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my ears. I slowly backed toward the side door, not taking my eyes off the stage. Then came footsteps. Soft, deliberate, coming from above, on the balcony. They stopped, then started again, slow and steady, as if someone were pacing back and forth, watching me. I told myself it was impossible. The doors were locked, no one else had access to the building, but the sound didn't stop. It followed my movements, echoing with every step I took. That was the breaking point. I ran to the side door, yanked it open, and the cold night air hit me like a wall. For a moment, I felt relief. But even as I stepped outside, I could still hear it. Faint footsteps echoing above me, fading into the distance. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely lock the door. I leaned against it, catching my breath, sweat dripping down my face. I didn't go back in that night. The next morning, I told another custodian what had happened. He laughed, said, "It's just an old building, man, probably settling or something," but I couldn't shake it. That whisper, that voice calling my name so softly and the footsteps pacing above me, I knew what I felt. Weeks later, I found out something that made my stomach turn. Years ago, a drama teacher had died suddenly in that same auditorium. A heart attack right on stage in front of his students. People said that sometimes, late at night, you could still hear him walking the stage or whispering through the seats. I tried to tell myself it was just a story, that the sounds were normal for an old building. But I can't forget the way that voice whispered my name, calm, patient, almost curious. The sound of those footsteps. The cold air that followed me even outside. Maybe I was tired, maybe I imagined it, but deep down, I know what I heard. And I'll never forget it. After that night, I never went back inside the auditorium. I refused to clean it, even when the others joked about it. Not long after, I quit that job for good. But sometimes, even when I was working in another part of the building, I'd still feel it. That cold pressure in the air, that quiet, heavy feeling of being watched. It's something you can't really explain unless you've felt it yourself. I know what I experienced was real, at least real to me, and I've never been the kind of person to imagine things or lose touch with reality. So, to this day, it still haunts me. Tell me, have you ever been alone somewhere and felt like someone was watching you, even when no one was there? Drop your story in the comments, I read them all. And if you think this one was unsettling, wait until you hear what happens in the next video. It's darker, stranger, and based on a true story.